The morning sun was just starting to peek through the clouds as Police Captain Singh pulled out of his driveway in his dark blue Honda Civic. It was a car that blended in with the rest of the neighborhood, not too flashy, not too old, just a regular family sedan that had seen its fair share of soccer games and grocery runs. The car's leather seats still held that hint of coffee smell from his morning commutes, and a small photo of his family hung from the rearview mirror. Today was like any other Wednesday, or at least that's how it started. Singh had woken up early, kissed his sleeping wife goodbye, and grabbed his travel mug of coffee from the kitchen counter. He was dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, no uniform today since he was heading to an important meeting at headquarters. After 15 years on the force and his recent promotion to Captain of Internal Affairs, he'd gotten used to wearing plain clothes more often than his blues. As he drove through his neighborhood, past the familiar faces of morning joggers and dog walkers, Singh couldn't help but smile at Mr. Kumar from next door, who was already out tending to his prized rose garden. The neighborhood was starting to wake up, kids waiting for school buses, people heading to work, the local coffee shop's open sign flickering to life. Singh turned onto Oak Street, heading towards the main road that would take him downtown. His mind was already running through the day ahead. There was that big meeting about updating the department's community outreach programs, followed by a stack of reports that needed his attention. He'd also promised to FaceTime his daughter during lunch. She was away at college and always had funny stories about her classes to share. The radio played softly in the background, some morning show hosts discussing the local high school football team's chances at the state championship. Singh adjusted his rearview mirror and noticed a patrol car that had been following him for the past few blocks. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were a common sight in this area. But something about the way this one kept pace with him, maintaining the same distance, caught his attention. Years of police work had taught Singh to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him something wasn't quite right. He made sure to follow every traffic rule to the letter, complete stops at stop signs, perfect signaling for lane changes, staying exactly at the speed limit. Not that he wouldn't do these things anyway, but today he felt like he was being watched, evaluated. As he approached the intersection near Pine Valley Road, Singh did what he always did, came to a complete stop, counted to 3, and then proceeded forward when it was clear. In his mirror, he saw the patrol car's lights suddenly flash to life, the blue and red reflecting off the morning dew on nearby cars. His heart didn't race, not exactly, but there was a familiar tightness in his chest, one that came from years of experiencing these situations from both sides of the badge. Singh knew exactly what to do. He slowly pulled over to the right, making his movements deliberate and calm. He turned down the radio, rolled down his window, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Through his side mirror, he watched as the officer stepped out of the patrol car. The morning had started so normally, but Singh knew what was about to happen would be anything but ordinary. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of all the times he'd trained younger officers about proper traffic stop procedures. Now, sitting on the other side of this situation, he was about to experience firsthand whether those lessons had taken root. Out of habit, he glanced at his wallet sitting on the passenger seat, knowing his badge was tucked inside. For a moment, he considered whether he should mention right away that he was a police captain. But something told him to wait, to let this play out naturally. Sometimes, he thought, the best lessons come from unexpected moments. In his mirror, he could see the officer approaching, hand resting near their holster, a detail that didn't escape Singh's trained eye. The morning sun was now fully up, promising a beautiful day ahead, but first, there was this situation to handle. Officer Wilson was new to this patrol route, having only worked this area for a few months. As he stepped out of his patrol car, the early morning air still had that crisp feel to it. His boots crunched against small pieces of gravel on the pavement, and he could hear the distant sound of a garbage truck making its rounds. He'd been following the blue Honda for several blocks, something about it catching his attention. The car looked too nice for this neighborhood, he thought to himself, a thought that made him pause for just a second. Why had he really made that assumption? The question flickered through his mind, but disappeared just as quickly. "Dispatch, I'm initiating a traffic stop." Wilson spoke into his shoulder radio, reciting the license plate number and location. The response crackled back, acknowledging his call. He adjusted his body camera, making sure it was recording department policy for every stop. As he approached the Honda, Wilson noticed how perfectly it was pulled over, aligned exactly parallel to the curb. Most people never managed that kind of precision during a traffic stop. The driver had already lowered their window and, from what he could see, had both hands placed on the steering wheel. Another unusual detail that tickled something in the back of his mind. The morning sun was hitting the car's side mirror just right, making it hard to see clearly inside. Wilson's hand instinctively rested near his holster, a habit from training that had stuck with him. As he got closer, he could see the driver was a middle-aged man in business casual clothes, sitting completely still, staring straight ahead. "Good morning," Wilson said, his voice coming out more stern than he'd intended. "License and registration, please." He noticed himself skipping the usual explanation for the stop. Another departure from standard procedure that he'd been taught at the academy. Why was he so tense? The driver hadn't done anything threatening. The man in the car spoke with a calm, measured voice that carried an unexpected note of authority. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my wallet on the passenger seat, and then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment. Is that all right with you?" Something about the way the driver handled himself made Wilson's neck prickle. This wasn't the usual nervous energy he got from traffic stops. This felt different. He watched as the man moved slowly, deliberately, narrating each movement like someone who knew exactly how these situations could go wrong. "The reason I pulled you over," Wilson finally said, trying to regain his commanding presence, "was for failing to make a complete stop at the intersection back there." Even as he said it, a small voice in his head reminded him that he'd seen the car stop completely. Had he really? Now he wasn't so sure. The driver's hands moved smoothly, reaching for his wallet. As he opened it to remove his license, something metallic caught the morning light. Wilson's eyes focused on it, and his breath caught in his throat. There, nestled next to the driver's license, was a police captain's badge. Time seemed to slow down. Wilson felt his face grow hot, and the morning air suddenly felt much cooler against his skin. His hand, still resting near his holster, felt heavy. The driver, no, the captain, hadn't said anything about his rank yet. He'd let Wilson walk right into this situation. The sounds around them seemed to fade away. The distant traffic, the birds chirping in the nearby trees, even the hum of car engines. All Wilson could hear was his own heartbeat and the quiet, professional voice of the man in the car as he held out his license and registration. This traffic stop was about to become something very different from what Wilson had expected when he turned on his lights. The morning sun continued to rise in the sky, warming the scene, but Wilson felt a different kind of heat, the kind that comes from realizing you might have made a serious mistake. The silence that hung in the air between the two men felt heavy with unspoken words. Officer Wilson stood there, the captain's license and registration in his trembling hands, trying to figure out what to say next. His mind raced through every training session he'd ever had, but none of them had prepared him for this exact moment. Inside the car, the captain remained perfectly still, watching Wilson's reflection in his side mirror. He noticed how the young officer's posture had changed, the confident stance now replaced with uncertainty. The morning traffic continued to pass by them, drivers slowing down to look at the scene, probably wondering what was happening. "Would you like to tell me what made you decide to follow my car this morning?" the captain asked, his voice calm but firm. He didn't raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he spoke like a teacher asking a student to explain their thinking. The question hung in the air, giving Wilson no easy escape. Wilson swallowed hard, his throat suddenly feeling dry. The body camera on his chest felt heavier than usual, knowing it was recording every second of this encounter. He looked down at the license again, reading the name and rank one more time, as if hoping the words might somehow change. Wilson started, then stopped. He looked at the car again, then at the captain, then back at his patrol car. "I thought I saw you roll through the stop sign," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. They both knew that wasn't the real reason. The captain turned slightly in his seat, making eye contact with Wilson for the first time. His eyes weren't angry, but they held a weight of experience that made Wilson want to look away. "Officer," the captain said, "I've been on the force for 15 years. Would you like to try that answer again?" A jogger passed by on the sidewalk, earbuds in, completely unaware of the important moment unfolding just feet away. The morning was getting warmer, and Wilson could feel sweat forming under his collar. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his boots scraping against the pavement. Wilson took a deep breath. I noticed your car in this neighborhood, and something just seemed off to me. The words felt terrible coming out of his mouth, but they were honest. He could feel his face getting hot with shame as he realized what he was admitting. The captain nodded slowly, taking in Wilson's words. And what exactly seemed off about seeing my car in this neighborhood? He asked, though they both knew he already understood the answer. The question wasn't meant to embarrass Wilson further, it was meant to make him think. A garbage truck rumbled past them, the sound filling the awkward silence for a moment. Wilson's hands were still holding the license and registration, but he'd forgotten they were there. His mind was racing through all the times he'd made similar decisions on patrol, all the cars he'd followed, all the assumptions he'd made. Sir, Wilson's voice cracked slightly. I made some assumptions I shouldn't have. I let my biases affect my judgment. The words came out quietly, but they felt enormous. Admitting it out loud made it more real, more serious. The captain reached over and turned off his car's engine. The click seemed unusually loud in the quiet morning air. Officer Wilson, he said, reading the name tag on Wilson's uniform, what do you think we should do about this situation? Wilson stood straighter, expecting to be reprimanded, maybe even reported. His heart was pounding so hard, he was sure the captain could hear it. But instead of anger, he saw something different in the captain's expression, a willingness to turn this mistake into something meaningful. Birds chirped in a nearby tree, oblivious to the important conversation happening below them. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows on the street. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a moment that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew exactly how yet. The captain stepped out of his car, closing the door softly behind him. Let's talk, he said, gesturing toward the sidewalk where they could speak more privately. The morning traffic continued to flow past them, creating a gentle background noise that made their conversation feel more intimate, less official. Officer Wilson hesitated for a moment, still holding the license and registration in his hands like they were somehow anchoring him to the spot. His training had never covered a situation quite like this. The usual power dynamic of a traffic stop had completely shifted, leaving him feeling unsteady. First, the captain said as they moved to the sidewalk, I want you to walk me through your approach just now. Tell me what you were thinking when you first saw my car. His voice wasn't accusatory. It carried the tone of someone genuinely interested in understanding. A school bus passed by, full of kids pressing their faces against the windows to see why a police car had someone pulled over. Wilson watched it drive past, remembering how he used to do the same thing when he was young, dreaming of becoming an officer. I spotted your car turning onto Oak Street, Wilson began, his voice steadier now. It was a nice car in a neighborhood where we've had some recent reports of suspicious vehicles. Even as he said it, he could hear how weak the explanation sounded. The captain nodded thoughtfully, letting the words hang in the air. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying the scent of someone's fresh-cut lawn. And what made my vehicle suspicious? He asked quietly. Was it the car itself, or was it something else? Wilson looked down at his boots, then back up at the captain. The morning sun was fully up now, warming the back of his neck. Sir, I made assumptions based on... He paused, gathering his courage to be honest, based on who I expected to see in this neighborhood. Instead of responding immediately, the captain turned to look at the houses along the street. Well-maintained lawns, carefully trimmed hedges, kids' bikes left out on front porches, signs of comfortable suburban life. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, he said finally. My kids grew up here. But you know what? You're not the first officer to pull me over within blocks of my own home. The weight of those words settled over them both. Wilson felt something twist in his stomach, a mixture of shame and recognition. He thought about all the traffic stops he'd made in his 2 years on the force, wondering how many other assumptions had guided his actions. Tell me about your training, the captain continued, his tone shifting slightly. What did they teach you about decision-making during patrol? He wasn't looking at Wilson now, giving the younger officer space to think and respond honestly. A pair of morning joggers passed by, their conversation fading in and out as they moved past. Wilson thought carefully before speaking. They taught us to look for suspicious behavior, to trust our instincts, he said. But maybe sometimes what we think are instincts are really just biases, the captain finished for him. Preconceptions that we might not even realize we're carrying. He turned back to face Wilson, his expression thoughtful. The tricky part is, these biases can feel like instinct. They can feel like good police work. But good police work is about facts, about actual behavior, not about assumptions. A delivery truck rumbled past, momentarily drowning out the morning birds. Wilson stood there, feeling the full impact of the captain's words. His hand, which had been resting near his holster out of habit, dropped to his side. The morning sun caught his badge, making it shine, a reminder of the responsibility it represented. "I've made a serious mistake," Wilson said finally, the words coming from a place of genuine understanding rather than just embarrassment. The body camera was still recording, capturing what had become less of a traffic stop and more of a life lesson. The captain checked his watch. His morning meeting at headquarters would have to wait. Some things were more important. He gestured to a nearby bench beneath a maple tree, where they could continue their conversation away from passing traffic. "You know," the captain began as they sat down, 20 years ago, I was in your shoes. Young officer, eager to prove myself, wanting to make a difference. He watched a leaf spiral down from the tree above them. I made mistakes too. The real question is what we learn from them. Officer Wilson sat with his back straight, still maintaining his professional posture despite the informal setting. The morning had warmed up considerably, and beads of sweat rolled down his temples. His patrol car's lights were still flashing silently behind them, creating moving shadows on the sidewalk. "The hardest part of being a good police officer," the captain continued, "isn't catching bad guys or solving crimes. It's looking at yourself in the mirror every day and being honest about your choices." He paused, watching a mother walk past pushing a stroller. She gave them a curious glance but kept moving. Wilson nodded slowly, his eyes focused on a crack in the sidewalk. "I always thought I was one of the good ones," he said quietly. "I never saw myself as, you know." He struggled to find the right words, his voice trailing off. "Biased." The captain finished for him. "None of us want to see ourselves that way. But it's not about being a good person or a bad person. It's about recognizing patterns in our thinking and choosing to change them." A school crossing guard's whistle sounded in the distance, marking the start of another school day. Wilson looked up at the captain, his expression more open now. "How do you do it? How do you stop these thoughts from affecting your decisions?" The questions came from a genuine place of wanting to learn, to be better. The captain smiled slightly, the first real smile since their encounter began. "It starts with exactly what you're doing right now, being willing to acknowledge it. Every time you make a decision on patrol, ask yourself, what's really driving this choice? Am I responding to actual suspicious behavior, or am I acting on assumptions?" A group of birds landed on the sidewalk near them, pecking at forgotten breakfast crumbs. The captain watched them for a moment before continuing. "You know what I see when I look at you, Officer Wilson? I see someone who could become an exceptional police officer. Not because you're perfect, but because you're willing to learn from your mistakes." Wilson's radio crackled with routine patrol chatter, but he made no move to respond. His shift supervisor would understand. This wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. This was something much more important. "I have a proposal for you," the captain said, straightening up slightly. "Instead of writing up this incident as a disciplinary action, I'd like you to do something more valuable." He paused, making sure he had Wilson's full attention. "I want you to come speak to our new recruits at the academy. Share this experience. Tell them what you've learned today." Wilson's eyes widened slightly. He'd expected punishment, maybe even a mark on his record. Instead, he was being offered a chance to turn his mistake into something positive. The weight that had been sitting on his chest since seeing the captain's badge began to lift slightly. "Sometimes," the captain said, watching another leaf fall from the maple tree, "our most powerful teaching moments come from our biggest mistakes. What matters isn't that we made the mistake, it's what we choose to do afterward." A garbage truck turned down the street, its hydraulic brakes hissing as it stopped at each house. The ordinary sound of everyday life continuing around them made their conversation feel even more significant, a small but important moment of change happening in the middle of a regular morning. The captain pulled out his phone, checking the time again. His morning meeting had started 15 minutes ago, but he'd already sent a quick message to postpone it. Right now, this conversation needed to happen. He could see something changing in the young officer's eyes, a kind of awakening that doesn't come from regular training sessions. "Let me tell you a story," the captain said, settling back on the bench. 10 years ago, I was driving my daughter to her piano recital. She was all dressed up, nervous about performing. We got pulled over 3 blocks from the concert hall. He paused, watching a couple of kids ride past on their bikes. She missed her performance because the officer spent 45 minutes checking and double-checking my license, registration, and insurance. Wilson listened intently, his notepad forgotten in his hand. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the maple leaves above them. A coffee shop across the street had started getting busy, the smell of fresh coffee drifting over on the breeze. "My daughter asked me that night why the police officer didn't believe I was really a police captain," the captain continued. "She was only 8. How do you explain something like that to a child?" He spoke without bitterness, just a quiet sadness that made Wilson's chest tighten. A mail carrier walked past, giving them a friendly wave. Both men nodded in response, this simple, normal interaction feeling somehow more meaningful in the middle of this serious conversation. The patrol car's lights had been turned off now, but occasional passers-by still glanced curiously at the 2 officers sitting on the bench. "The thing is," the captain said, turning slightly to face Wilson, "that officer probably went home thinking he was just being thorough. He probably told himself he was doing his job well. But what he really did was teach a young girl her first lesson about prejudice." Wilson took off his cap, running his hand through his hair. The morning heat was building, but that wasn't why he was sweating. "I never thought about how these stops affect families," he admitted. "Kids seeing their parents pulled over." The captain nodded. "Every interaction we have shapes how people view law enforcement. Every traffic stop, every conversation, every decision we make on patrol, it all adds up." A school bus passed by, reminding them both of all the young eyes that might be watching their actions. "I want you to start keeping a log," the captain said, his tone becoming more practical. "Every traffic stop, every person you question on patrol, write down what made you suspicious. Be honest with yourself about your reasons. At the end of each week, review those notes. Look for patterns." Wilson pulled out his small patrol notebook, flipping to a clean page. The captain noticed how his hands were steady now, the nervousness from earlier replaced by a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about avoiding trouble anymore, this was about becoming a better officer. "And one more thing," the captain added, standing up from the bench. "I want you to ride along with some of our veteran officers from different backgrounds. See how they handle patrol decisions. Learn from their experiences." He brushed off his slacks, preparing to head back to his car. A group of office workers walked past, heading to the coffee shop. Their casual chatter about morning meetings and deadlines seemed to come from a different world than the important conversation happening on the bench. Wilson stood too, clutching his notebook like it contained something precious. "Sir," Wilson said, his voice firmer now, more certain. "Thank you. Not just for not reporting this, but for—" he gestured vaguely with his hand, trying to find the right words. "For treating you like someone worth teaching." The captain finished with a slight smile. "That's what good police work is about, Officer Wilson. We're all works in progress. The key is to keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep being honest with ourselves." Back at the police station later that afternoon, Officer Wilson sat at his desk, staring at his blank computer screen. The events of the morning kept playing through his mind as he tried to write his report. The usual template for traffic stops didn't seem right for what had happened. The station buzzed with its usual afternoon activity, phones ringing, officers chatting, the coffee maker in the break room gurgling as it brewed another pot. But Wilson barely noticed any of it. He opened a new document and began typing, determined to be completely honest about what had occurred. Having trouble with that report. A friendly voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Chen, a veteran cop who'd been with the department for 12 years. She placed a fresh cup of coffee on Wilson's desk, noticing his troubled expression. I pulled over the wrong person today, Wilson said quietly, careful not to be overheard by the whole station. Actually, no, I pulled someone over for the wrong reasons. The difference felt important to point out. Chen pulled up a chair, sensing this was more than just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. The afternoon sun streamed through the station windows, creating bright squares on the worn linoleum floor. In one of them, dust particles danced in the light, moving in slow circles like Wilson's thoughts. You know, Chen said, taking a sip of her own coffee, my first year on the job, I made some calls I'm not proud of. We all do. The real test isn't whether we make mistakes, it's whether we learn from them. She hadn't heard about Wilson's morning encounter yet, but something in his expression told her this was important. Wilson turned to face her fully. How do you check yourself? I mean, how do you make sure you're making the right decisions for the right reasons? The questions came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them in all day. A printer whirred to life nearby, spitting out reports. The familiar sound of keyboard clicks and radio chatter filled the background as Chen considered her response. I started keeping a journal, she said finally. Every stop, every interaction. Not just what happened, but why I made each decision. It helps you see patterns you might not notice otherwise. Wilson looked down at his notebook, where he'd already started logging his stops just as the captain had suggested. Maybe he wasn't the only one who'd needed to learn these lessons. The thought was both comforting and sobering. The captain wants me to speak to the new recruits, he said, still not quite believing it. About what happened today. About learning from mistakes. The words felt strange in his mouth, but right somehow. Ken's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded with approval. That takes guts. Most officers would rather forget about their mistakes, not stand up and talk about them. She took another sip of coffee, thinking, you know what? That might do more good than 100 textbook lessons. The late afternoon sun had shifted, creating long shadows across the desk. Wilson's report was still mostly blank on the screen, but he felt clearer about what he needed to write. No excuses, no trying to justify his actions, just the truth about what happened and what he'd learned. I keep thinking about all my other traffic stops, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. How many times did I tell myself I was just being thorough when really, he couldn't finish the sentence, but Chen understood. That's a heavy weight to carry, she said, standing up and straightening her uniform. But recognizing it is the first step to being a better officer. She paused, then added, you know, we've got a community outreach meeting tomorrow night. Why don't you come along? See how we're trying to build trust in all neighborhoods. Wilson nodded, finally starting to type his report. The words came easier now, honest and clear. Around him, the station continued its normal afternoon routine, but he felt different. Something had shifted inside him, like a door opening to let in fresh air and new understanding. 2 weeks had passed since that morning traffic stop. The police academy classroom was filled with 30 fresh-faced recruits, all sitting up straight in their chairs as Officer Wilson stood at the podium. His hands weren't shaking anymore when he thought about that morning, but his heart still beat a little faster. I thought I was doing good police work, he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. I thought I was trusting my instincts. But that morning taught me the difference between real police instincts and assumptions we don't even realize we're making. The captain sat in the back of the room, watching quietly. He'd arrived early, nodding encouragingly to Wilson before taking his seat. Through the classroom windows, trees swayed in the afternoon breeze, their shadows dancing on the walls like quiet witnesses to this moment. It would be easy to stand here and just tell you what to do, Wilson continued, moving away from the podium to stand closer to the recruits. But instead, I want to tell you about what I did wrong and what I learned from it. The room was completely silent now, every eye focused on him. He told them everything, the assumptions he'd made, the way he'd approached the car, the moment he discovered his mistake. But more importantly, he told them about what came after. About the conversation that changed how he saw his role as a police officer. Since that day, Wilson said, picking up his patrol notebook, I've logged every stop I've made, every person I've questioned, and I write down exactly why I made each decision. He held up the notebook, its pages now filled with 2 weeks of honest self-reflection. A hand went up in the middle of the room. But what if we really do spot something suspicious? A young recruit asked. How do we know the difference between real suspicion and, you know? Wilson nodded, appreciating the honest question. That's exactly what we need to ask ourselves every time. Is this person's behavior actually suspicious, or am I seeing what I expect to see? Are they breaking any laws, or am I making assumptions based on how they look or where they are? The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the dust motes in the air. Someone's phone buzzed quietly, but nobody moved to check it. The lesson was too important to miss. Last week, Wilson continued, I was patrolling the same neighborhood. I saw a car that 2 weeks ago I probably would have pulled over. But this time, I asked myself those questions first. Turned out it was just a grandfather picking up his grandkids from soccer practice. The captain shifted in his seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd been right about Wilson. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons themselves. Your badge gives you authority, Wilson said, touching his own badge briefly. But it also gives you responsibility. Responsibility to be fair, to be honest, especially with ourselves. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many recruits as he could. The presentation wasn't just about that one traffic stop anymore. It had become something bigger. A chance to shape how these new officers would approach their jobs from day one. Wilson could see it in their faces, some nodding in understanding, others lost in thought, all of them taking in the importance of this lesson. Next week, he announced, you'll all be doing ride-alongs with different officers from our department. Officers from different backgrounds, with different experiences. Listen to them. Learn from them. And most importantly, learn to question your own assumptions. As he wrapped up his presentation, the captain stood quietly and slipped out of the room. His presence had been important, but this was Wilson's moment, a chance to turn a mistake into a stepping stone for change. Through the open door, the sounds of the police station drifted in. Phones ringing, radios crackling, the everyday symphony of law enforcement continuing as usual. 3 months had passed since that morning traffic stop. The police department's community center was packed for the monthly neighborhood meeting. Officer Wilson stood at the back of the room, watching as residents filed in, familiar faces now, not just strangers he passed on patrol. The evening sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. Parents with young children, elderly couples, local business owners, they all settled into their seats, chatting with each other and, more importantly, with the officers present. The atmosphere was different from the tense community meetings Wilson remembered from his first year on the force. Hard to believe how much has changed, isn't it? The captain's voice came from beside him. He'd arrived quietly, as he often did, to observe these meetings. The two men had developed an unexpected mentorship over the past months, turning that morning's mistake into a catalyst for department-wide changes. Wilson nodded, thinking about his patrol log sitting in his back pocket. The notebook was almost full now. 3 months of honest reflection, of questioning his decisions, of learning to be a better officer. The new tracking system is making a difference, he said. When officers have to write down their reasons for every stop, it makes them think twice. A young mother walked past with her 2 kids, waving at Wilson. He'd met them at last month's community picnic, where officers and residents had shared food and stories. The barrier between us and them was slowly breaking down, one conversation at a time. You know what the best part is? Wilson continued, keeping his voice low. The other day, one of our veteran officers told me he started keeping a log too. Said he never realized how many of his stops were based on hunches that didn't hold up when he wrote them down. The meeting was about to start, but the captain took a moment to look around the room. Community members were sitting side by side with officers, sharing updates about neighborhood watch programs, discussing local concerns. The fear and distrust that used to fill these meetings had been replaced by something that felt more like partnership. Remember last week? Wilson asked, smiling slightly. That call about a suspicious person in the park. The captain nodded, knowing where this was going. Turned out to be the high school track team doing their morning practice. Old me would have rolled up with lights flashing. Instead, I got out of my car, introduced myself, and ended up learning about their upcoming meet. The community center's old air conditioning hummed overhead, mixing with the sound of conversations and children's laughter. Someone had brought cookies. The smell of chocolate chip and coffee filled the air, making the meeting feel more like a gathering of neighbors than a formal police event. Your story has spread to other departments, the captain said quietly. That presentation you gave at the academy, they're using it in training sessions across the state now. He paused, watching a group of teenagers enter the room. Kids who used to avoid police officers now felt comfortable enough to attend community meetings. Wilson thought about all the traffic stops he hadn't made in the past 3 months, the times he'd questioned his initial reactions and found them wanting. But he also thought about the stops he had made based on actual suspicious behavior, not assumptions. Those stops had led to real police work, to protecting the community in ways that built trust instead of breaking it. The meeting was starting now. The room quieted down as the community liaison officer stepped up to the podium. Wilson and the captain took seats in the back, just 2 more members of this growing community. Through the windows, the evening sky was turning purple and orange, another day ending in a neighborhood that felt a little more like home to everyone in it. You know what? Wilson whispered to the captain as the meeting began. That morning traffic stop, it might have been the best mistake I ever made. The captain just nodded, both of them knowing that sometimes the best lessons come from moments we least expect, and real change starts with the courage to learn from them.